They changed the code again on June 1st, 1942. Commander Joseph Rochefort stood in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor, holding a decrypted message fragment that had taken his team 18 hours to break. The message was 3 days old. In 3 days, the Japanese fleet could cross half the Pacific. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. The air in the dungeon, as his team called it, was stale and thick with cigarette smoke. Banks of IBM tabulating machines clattered in the background, punch cards feeding through mechanical sorters. 27 crypt analysts worked at makeshift desks, constructed from packing crates and plywood, surrounded by filing cabinets stuffed with worksheets covered in 5-digit code groups. The message fragment mentioned AF, just those 2 letters. AF was a location. That much was certain. The Japanese were planning something involving AF, and the message traffic had increased dramatically over the past 2 weeks. Hundreds of intercepts, most still unreadable, but the volume alone suggested a major operation. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. His superiors in Washington disagreed. They thought AF meant the Aleutian Islands, or possibly even the Hawaiian chain itself. The entire Pacific War might turn on correctly identifying 2 letters in an encrypted message. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese Navy believed their communications were secure. They had every reason for this confidence. The main operational code, designated JN25 by American cryptanalysts, was extraordinarily complex. Each code group consisted of 5 digits selected from a codebook containing approximately 33,000 entries. These groups were then enciphered using an additive system drawn from a separate book of random number tables. An intercepted message was therefore encrypted twice. First, the original Japanese text was encoded into 5-digit groups using the codebook. Then each group was mathematically combined with another 5-digit additive taken from the cipher tables. The result was a message that appeared as endless columns of meaningless numbers. To read such a message, you needed both books. The codebook to convert the 5-digit groups into their original Japanese meaning, and the additive tables to reverse the mathematical encipherment. The Japanese Navy had distributed these books to every major command, every fleet, every operational unit that needed to communicate. They changed the additive tables periodically, sometimes monthly, sometimes more frequently during active operations. They changed the entire codebook less often, but when they did, all previous cryptanalytic work became worthless. Analysts had to start over, building a new codebook recovery from scratch. The Japanese assumed this system was unbreakable by any practical means. Breaking it would require capturing both books, which were kept under strict security aboard ships and at naval bases. Guards were posted. Officers were held personally responsible. The books were printed on water-soluble paper that would disintegrate if thrown overboard during an emergency. Even if the enemy somehow obtained old copies, the frequent changes to additives and periodic complete code revisions would limit any intelligence value. Japanese communications officers had been trained in these procedures at the Naval Communications School in Yokosuka. They had practiced encryption and decryption until the mechanical process became automatic. They trusted the system because the system was mathematically sound and operationally secure. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that the Americans were not trying to capture the codebooks. The Americans were rebuilding them, digit by digit, meaning by meaning, through patient cryptanalytic work that had been ongoing since before the war began. The Japanese Navy's confidence in their communication security was not arrogance. It was based on sound cryptographic practice and careful operational security measures that had been developed over 2 decades. The service had begun seriously studying communications encryption in the early 1920s, influenced by reports that Western nations were reading Japanese diplomatic traffic. The Navy had established its own cryptographic section, separate from diplomatic code systems, specifically to protect operational military communications. JN-25 was introduced in June 1939, replacing an earlier system that Navy cryptographers considered potentially vulnerable. The new code represented the state-of-the-art in manual cipher systems. It was not a machine cipher like the German Enigma or the American Sigaba. It was a hand cipher system, requiring only code books, additive tables, and trained personnel. This was deliberate. Machine ciphers required physical devices that could be captured or malfunction. Hand ciphers required only books and paper, which could be destroyed instantly if capture seemed imminent. The codebook itself was a thick volume containing approximately 33,000 five-digit code groups, each representing a specific word, phrase, number, letter, or common military term in Japanese. The book was organized systematically. Code groups in the 40,000 series typically represented geographic locations. Groups in the 50,000 series often indicated ship types or unit designations. Common operational terms had their own ranges. This organization made encoding faster for trained operators, though it also introduced patterns that skilled cryptanalysts might eventually exploit. Once a message was encoded into these five-digit groups, the enciphering process began. The cipher clerk would consult the additive table book, which contained pages of random five-digit numbers arranged in columns. Starting at a specified page and column, the clerk would add each additive number to each code group using non-carrying addition. In non-carrying addition, if the sum of two digits exceeded 9, you simply use the last digit without carrying to the next column. For example, 7 plus 6 equals 13, but in non-carrying addition, you would write 3. This mathematical process transformed the already encoded message into a completely different set of five-digit groups. The result was transmitted by radio in Morse code. Japanese radio operators sent thousands of these messages daily. Fleet movements, logistics requests, intelligence reports, operational orders, personnel transfers, weather observations, damage reports. Every aspect of naval operations generated communications traffic. High-frequency radio signals traveled thousands of miles, bouncing off the ionosphere, reaching stations across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The Japanese knew the Americans were listening. Radio interception was a fundamental aspect of naval operations. Every Navy maintained listening posts to monitor enemy transmissions. The question was not whether the enemy could hear your signals, but whether they could read them. Japanese communications security officers conducted regular inspections. They checked that code books were properly secured in weighted bags ready for emergency destruction. They verified that cipher clerks were following correct procedures. They monitored message traffic for any signs of encryption errors that might compromise security. They reminded personnel constantly that communications discipline was essential to operational security. One captured code book, one clerk who wrote down an additive sequence, one ship that failed to destroy its cipher materials before sinking, could potentially compromise the entire system. The Navy instituted additional security measures. Code groups for particularly sensitive terms were changed more frequently than the main code book. A special list of variant code groups for important locations and commands was distributed separately and updated regularly. Messages containing highly classified information were sometimes double-enciphered, encrypted twice using different additive sequences. During major operations, radio silence was maintained when possible, with messages held until after the operation concluded or transmitted only when absolutely necessary. These were not the practices of a service that was careless about communication security. These were sophisticated measures implemented by professionals who understood cryptography and took their responsibilities seriously. The Japanese Navy had every reason to believe their communications were protected. What they did not account for was the possibility that an enemy might dedicate hundreds of people, thousands of hours, and significant resources to the patient mathematical work of breaking their codes without ever seeing a codebook. The effort to break JN-25 began before the United States entered the war. Navy cryptanalysts had been studying Japanese communications since the Washington Naval Treaty negotiations of the early 1920s. By the mid-1930s, a small group of specialists at the Office of Naval Communications in Washington was attempting to read Japanese naval traffic. The work was theoretical, academic, and largely unsuccessful. The codes were too complex, the volume of traffic too limited, the resources too few. This changed after 1940. As tensions increased between Japan and the United States, the Navy expanded its cryptanalytic efforts. 3 stations were established specifically to intercept and analyze Japanese naval communications. Station Negei in Washington coordinated overall efforts and focused on diplomatic and attaché traffic. Station Cast at Cavite in the Philippines, later relocated to Corregidor and then to Melbourne, Australia, intercepted traffic from the Western Pacific. Station HIPO at Pearl Harbor covered the Central Pacific and eventually became the most important center for JN-25 cryptanalysis. Each station required specialized personnel, radio operators who could copy high-speed Morse code in Japanese kana characters, traffic analysts who studied message externals, the call signs, frequencies, and transmission patterns that revealed information even when the content remained encrypted. Cryptanalysts who understood mathematics, language, and the patient puzzle-solving work of code reconstruction. Translators who could render decrypted Japanese text into accurate English. IBM machine operators who maintained the punch-card tabulators that made large-scale statistical analysis possible. Commander Joseph Rochefort arrived at Station HIPO in June 1941. He was an unusual officer. He had spent years in Japan learning the language and studying Japanese culture. He had worked in naval communications and understood cryptography. He had the temperament for the work, patient but obsessive, capable of focusing on a single problem for days until he found a solution. He assembled a team of specialists, many of them reserve officers and enlisted men with backgrounds in mathematics, languages, or music. The ability to recognize patterns, whether in numbers, words, or sounds, was more important than traditional naval experience. The work was mathematical detective work. Without the Japanese codebooks, the cryptanalysts had to reconstruct them through analysis of the encrypted traffic itself. They began with frequencies. Certain 5-digit code groups appeared more often than others in the encrypted messages. In any language, certain words appear more frequently. In naval communications, certain terms are unavoidable. Water, ship, position, time, fuel, ammunition. These concepts appear in almost every operational message. If you could identify which encrypted code groups represented these common terms, you could begin building a partial codebook. They used cribs, sections of text whose content could be guessed. Weather reports followed predictable formats. Position reports contained geographic coordinates. Administrative messages about personnel transfers used standard phrasing. If you intercepted a message and could guess even part of its content, you could work backwards to determine what code groups represented the known text. Each recovered code group was one more entry in the reconstructed codebook. They studied depths, multiple messages encrypted with the same additive sequence. Japanese cipher clerks were supposed to use each section of the additive tables only once, but errors occurred. When 2 different messages used the same additives, the mathematical relationship between them could be exploited. The cryptanalysts could subtract one encrypted message from another, eliminating the additives and revealing the relationship between the underlying code groups. This didn't immediately reveal the meaning, but it provided mathematical relationships that helped narrow possibilities. They maintained meticulous records. Every recovered code group was entered on IBM punch cards. Every suspected meaning was cross-referenced. Every pattern was documented. The work was cumulative. Each small success made subsequent work slightly easier. By December 7, 1941, When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, the cryptanalysts had recovered perhaps 15% of the JN-25 codebook, enough to read fragments of messages, enough to know something was happening, not enough to know where or when, not enough to provide the operational warning that might have prevented the attack. In the months after Pearl Harbor, the work intensified with desperate urgency. The breakthrough came through monotony and mathematics. Station HIPO operated 24 hours a day in the basement that had once housed the 14th Naval District's Combat Intelligence Unit. The space was never designed for cryptanalytic work. It had no windows, inadequate ventilation, and barely enough room for the desks, filing cabinets, and IBM machines that filled every available space. Summer temperatures in Honolulu made the basement oppressive. Men worked in their undershirts, electric fans pushing hot air around the cramped room. The noise was constant. Typewriters clattered. Tabulators clicked and whirred. Conversations overlapped as analysts consulted each other on problematic code groups or suspicious patterns. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer headed the cryptanalytics section. He was a Naval Academy graduate with a gift for mathematics who had been working on Japanese code since 1936. He understood that breaking JN-25 was not about sudden inspiration or brilliant individual insights. It was about systematic, relentless application of mathematical principles to large volumes of data. Every intercepted message was logged. Every 5-digit group was punched onto IBM cards. The machines sorted these cards, counting frequencies, identifying repeats, finding statistical patterns that human analysts could never spot by eye alone. The work required understanding how Japanese language and naval terminology functioned. Japanese used different grammatical structures than English. Verbs came at the end of sentences. Certain particles indicated relationships between words. Naval messages followed conventions. Orders used specific verb forms. Reports followed standard formats. If you knew a message was a position report, you knew it would contain certain elements in a predictable sequence. Geographic coordinates, time groups, unit identifiers. Each element was encoded with specific code groups. Finding one element helped identify others. Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan handled the linguistic side. He had studied Japanese at the Navy Language School in Tokyo in the 1930s. He knew not just vocabulary, but how ideas were expressed, how military formality shaped phrasing, how different ranks and positions used different levels of politeness. This cultural knowledge was as important as mathematical skill. When cryptanalysts recovered a code group and proposed a possible meaning, Finnegan could assess whether that meaning made sense in Japanese naval context. They built the codebook entry by entry. Code group 47321 appeared frequently in messages that seemed to be position reports. Analysis of surrounding groups and message context suggested it might mean battleship or possibly carrier. More traffic, more analysis, more cross-referencing gradually narrowed the possibilities. 47321 was confirmed as battleship. That single confirmed entry helped identify related terms. Code groups appearing near battleship in multiple messages were likely related naval terminology. Fleet, division, cruiser, destroyer. Each recovery accelerated subsequent work. The additive tables presented a different challenge. The Japanese changed these frequently, sometimes as often as monthly. Every change meant the cryptanalysts had to identify the new additives before they could begin extracting code groups from encrypted messages. They did this through statistical analysis of message traffic. When the same code group was encrypted with different additives, it produced different ciphertext. But mathematical relationships between messages could reveal the underlying structure. The process was called stripping. Analysts would hypothesize that certain encrypted groups represented known code groups, calculate what additives would be required to produce that encryption, then test whether those additives worked on other parts of the message. It was exhausting work. A single message might require hours of analysis. Analysts worked on problems until they reached solutions or exhaustion, whichever came first. Rochefort himself worked 18 and 20-hour days, sleeping on a cot in a side room, living on coffee and sandwiches brought in by yeomen. His team followed his example. They understood that somewhere in the Pacific, Japanese fleet units were maneuvering according to orders transmitted in the code they were trying to break. Every hour spent breaking a message was an hour closer to reading those orders. By April 1942, Station HIPO could read perhaps 40% of intercepted JN-25 traffic. Not every message, not every code group, but enough to extract operational intelligence. They knew the Japanese were planning major operations. They knew the First Air Fleet, which had struck Pearl Harbor, was involved. They knew target dates were approaching. What they did not know with certainty was where the Japanese intended to strike. The intercepted traffic mentioned AF repeatedly, but AF was itself a code designation, and its identity remained unclear. Rochefort needed proof. Washington analysts believed AF designated the Aleutian Islands. Some intelligence officers thought it might mean Hawaii itself, possibly even Pearl Harbor again. Rochefort was convinced AF meant Midway, the tiny atoll 1,100 miles northwest of Honolulu. The conviction came from patterns in the traffic. Messages mentioning AF discussed fresh water supplies, suggesting a small, isolated location. They mentioned air patrols, indicating an island with an airfield. They mentioned distances and refueling points that made sense for Midway, but not for the Aleutians or Hawaii. But conviction was not proof. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters above the dungeon where HIPO worked, needed certainty before he committed his 3 remaining aircraft carriers to defend Midway. If Rochefort was wrong, if the Japanese struck elsewhere while American carriers waited at Midway, the consequences would be catastrophic. Rochefort proposed a deception. Midway would transmit an uncoded message reporting a problem with its fresh water distillation plant. The message would be sent by undersea cable to Hawaii, then transmitted by radio as if it originated from Midway. If Japanese intercept stations picked up this transmission, and if AF really was Midway, then subsequent Japanese encrypted traffic should mention the water shortage. Commander Cyril Simard, in charge of Midway's defenses, sent the message on May 19th. 2 days later, HIPO intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of fresh water. Rochefort had his proof. AF was Midway. The Japanese were coming, and now Nimitz knew where to position his carriers. The intelligence became more specific as the operation date approached. HIPO read messages detailing the Japanese order of battle. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu under Admiral Nagumo. Battleships in support, cruisers, destroyers, submarines. A separate invasion force with transports carrying troops for the ground assault. The attack was scheduled for early June. American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, hastily repaired after damage at Coral Sea, took positions northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush for an enemy fleet whose every movement had been read in advance. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Japanese had no idea they had been compromised. On June 4th, Nagumo's carriers launched their first strike against Midway as planned. American aircraft were already airborne, searching. At 9:30 in the morning, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown caught 3 Japanese carriers with their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed. In 6 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning wrecks. Hiryu launched a counterattack that damaged Yorktown before being destroyed herself that afternoon. By evening, the combined fleet that had seemed invincible 6 months earlier had lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers and hundreds of its most experienced pilots. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the operation from the battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind the carrier force, received fragmentary reports of disaster. His carefully planned operation had walked into an ambush. The Americans had been waiting exactly where his carriers would be most vulnerable. Yamamoto ordered a general retreat. The invasion of Midway was canceled. The Japanese Navy's offensive capability in the Pacific had been broken. The victory was attributed publicly to American air reconnaissance and good fortune. The role of communications intelligence remained completely secret. Japanese officers analyzing the disaster concluded they had been unlucky, caught at a vulnerable moment by American search planes. They never suspected that their enemy had been reading their operational orders for weeks before the battle. The JN-25 code system had performed exactly as designed. Cipher clerks had followed procedures correctly, security protocols had been maintained, and yet every major order, every fleet movement, every operational detail had been known to the Americans nearly as soon as it was transmitted. The code breaking continued with increasing success. By late 1942, Station HIPO and its sister stations could read approximately 60% of intercepted JN-25 traffic. The Japanese had changed their additive tables after Midway, forcing the cryptanalysts to start that portion of the work over. But the basic codebook remained the same, and the Americans had now recovered perhaps half of its 33,000 entries. Every new message provided more context, more relationships, more confirmed code groups. The reconstructed codebook grew steadily more complete. The intelligence-shaped Pacific strategy. When HIPO read messages indicating Japanese reinforcement convoys heading for Guadalcanal, submarines were positioned along the routes. When encrypted orders detailed fleet movements, American commanders knew where Japanese ships would be before they arrived. When supply requirements appeared in logistics messages, analysts could calculate Japanese strength and intentions. The advantage was extraordinary, but it had to be used carefully. Intelligence too precisely acted upon would reveal to the Japanese that their communications were compromised. Procedures were established. Every action based on decrypted intelligence required a cover story. If submarines were sent to intercept a convoy whose route was known from decrypts, reconnaissance aircraft were sent to the area first to provide a plausible explanation for the contact. If American forces avoided a Japanese operation revealed through signals intelligence, alternative intelligence sources were documented to justify the decision. The secret had to be protected even at the cost of sometimes not acting on intelligence when doing so would raise Japanese suspicions. The Japanese Navy did investigate potential security breaches. After Midway, communications officers reviewed procedures and considered whether the code might have been compromised. They conducted tests, examining whether the complexity of JN-25 made cryptanalysis feasible. Their conclusion was that breaking the code without captured materials would require resources and time beyond any reasonable capability. The Americans might have captured a code book from a sunken ship or overrun position, but the regular changes to additive tables would limit the value of such a capture. The investigation found no evidence of compromise and recommended only minor procedural adjustments. This conclusion was understandable. Japanese cryptographers knew their own system's strength. They knew how much work they had put into designing a secure cipher. They knew the mathematical complexity involved. What they did not know was that the Americans had made code breaking an industrial process. Hundreds of people, sophisticated IBM machinery, purpose-built facilities, unlimited funding. The U.S. Navy had committed resources to communications intelligence that the Japanese had never imagined an enemy might dedicate to such work. By April 1943, the reconstructed codebook was comprehensive enough that most operational traffic could be read within hours of interception. Station HIPO had expanded. More crypt analysts, more translators, more IBM operators, more space. The dungeon had grown into a full intelligence organization. Similar expansion had occurred at the other stations. The success rate on JN-25 traffic exceeded 75%. 3 out of every 4 encrypted messages could now be read. some completely, others partially, but enough to extract operationally useful intelligence. On April 13, 1943, HIPO intercepted and decrypted a message that would test the limits of how signals intelligence could be used. The message detailed an inspection tour by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet. Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. The message provided exact departure time, flight route, arrival time, and the information that Yamamoto would be flying in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The architect of Pearl Harbor, Japan's most capable naval strategist, would be flying a predictable route at a known time in an aircraft the Americans could intercept. The intelligence reached Washington within hours. The decision reached the highest levels of American command. Yamamoto's death would damage Japanese morale and deprive their navy of its most experienced commander. But shooting down his aircraft based on such specific intelligence would inevitably raise questions about how the Americans knew his exact itinerary. The risk to the code-breaking secret was significant. After consultation with Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and President Roosevelt himself, the decision was made to proceed. The target was too valuable, the opportunity too perfect. On April 18, 1943, at 6:10 in the morning, Admiral Yamamoto's transport aircraft departed Rabaul exactly on schedule. The admiral sat in the lead bomber with his staff. A second bomber carried additional personnel. 6 Zero fighters provided escort. The formation flew at 4,500 feet, maintaining the course and timing specified in the message that American analysts had decrypted 5 days earlier. 400 miles away, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters from the 339th Fighter Squadron took off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Major John Mitchell led the mission. His orders were explicit. Intercept the Japanese formation over Bougainville at exactly 9:35, the time specified in the decrypted message for Yamamoto's arrival. The flight required precise navigation over open ocean, arriving at exactly the right location at exactly the right moment. Mitchell's aircraft were equipped with extra fuel tanks for the extended range. They flew low, barely 50 feet above the water, to avoid Japanese radar stations. The timing was perfect, because the Americans knew every detail: departure time, flight route, cruising altitude, arrival time. Knowledge that came from reading encrypted messages that the Japanese believed were secure. At 9:34, Mitchell's formation spotted the Japanese aircraft approaching Bougainville, exactly where the decrypted message said they would be. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from the formation and attacked. Lanphier engaged the Zero escorts while Barber targeted the bombers. His gunfire struck Yamamoto's aircraft. The bomber broke apart and crashed into the jungle. There were no survivors. The second bomber was also shot down. Japanese personnel on Bougainville recovered Yamamoto's body the following day. He had been killed instantly by machine gun fire. The commander who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had led the Combined Fleet through its early victories, was dead. The loss devastated Japanese morale. Yamamoto was irreplaceable, a strategist of international reputation, respected even by his enemies. His death was announced publicly 3 weeks later, after an elaborate state funeral. The Japanese attributed the interception to bad luck, a chance encounter with American fighters on patrol. American commanders maintained the deception carefully. Reports stated that coast watchers on Bougainville had spotted the formation and radioed Henderson Field. This cover story was documented and became the official explanation. No mention was made of communications intelligence. The secret remained protected, but the incident forced a reassessment of operational security. If American fighters could intercept a formation at precisely the right time and place, Japanese officers wondered whether their communications might somehow be compromised, despite the technical impossibility of breaking Gen 25. Additional security measures were implemented. Code groups for senior officer movements were changed more frequently. Messages containing sensitive travel information were sometimes hand-delivered rather than transmitted by radio. Cipher clerks received additional training on proper procedures, but these measures addressed symptoms without identifying the actual problem. The Japanese still believed their basic code system was secure. They still trusted that mathematical complexity and regular additive changes protected their communications. They still assumed that cryptanalysis without captured materials was effectively impossible. The Americans continued reading their traffic. Station HIPO, now redesignated Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, expanded further. Additional linguists were recruited from universities and language schools. More IBM equipment was installed. Sophisticated techniques for traffic analysis and code recovery were developed and refined. By mid-1943, the percentage of readable JN-25 traffic approached 80%. Some messages could be decrypted and translated within hours of interception. The combined fleet was conducting operations while an enemy read its orders almost in real time. The advantage shaped every subsequent naval engagement in the Pacific. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Admiral Raymond Spruance knew the Japanese fleet's composition, location, and intentions from decrypted messages. The result was what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation lost 476 aircraft and 3 carriers. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, decrypted messages revealed Japanese plans for a complex 3-pronged attack. American commanders positioned forces to counter each element. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Their fleet as an offensive force ceased to exist. Japanese communications officers never fully understood what had happened. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, they continued using JN-25 with modifications and updates. They changed additive tables regularly. They modified high-value code groups. They implemented additional security procedures. They investigated potential compromises after suspicious incidents. Each investigation concluded that the code system itself remained sound. Specific codebooks might have been captured in isolated instances, but the overall system was intact and functional. This conclusion was both logical and completely wrong. It was logical because Japanese cryptographers correctly understood that breaking JN-25 without captured materials should be theoretically impossible, given the resources they imagined an enemy might dedicate to cryptanalysis. It was wrong because they fundamentally underestimated the scale of the American effort. The United States had industrialized code breaking the same way it had industrialized aircraft production, shipbuilding, and every other aspect of modern warfare. By 1944, thousands of personnel were involved in signals intelligence operations across the Pacific. Intercept stations on islands, ships, and submarines monitored Japanese radio frequencies continuously. Traffic was forwarded to analysis centers where cryptanalysts, translators, and intelligence specialists processed the material. IBM machines ran continuously, sorting punch cards, identifying patterns, updating the reconstructed codebooks. The operation consumed resources on a scale that Japanese planners had never conceived an enemy might dedicate to simply reading messages. The intercepted intelligence revealed not just operational plans, but the deteriorating state of Japanese forces. Logistics messages showed fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, replacement aircraft shortages. Personnel transfers indicated where units were being reinforced or withdrawn. Damage reports detailed losses more accurately than Japanese commanders might report through official channels. Administrative traffic revealed morale problems, training deficiencies, and organizational dysfunction. The cumulative picture was of a military machine that was being ground down by attrition it could not replace. Japanese naval personnel writing and receiving these encrypted messages had no idea their communications were being read. A destroyer captain reporting his fuel status, a logistics officer requisitioning ammunition, a staff officer transmitting operational orders. Each believed their messages were protected by unbreakable encryption. They followed procedures. They encrypted properly. They maintained physical security of code materials. And every message they sent provided more intelligence to an enemy who had been reading their mail for years. The psychological impact of this systematic compromise, had Japanese forces known about it, would have been devastating. Cryptographic security is fundamental to military operations. If you cannot communicate securely, you cannot coordinate. If you cannot coordinate, you cannot execute complex operations. Every navy understood this. The Japanese had invested significant effort in creating what they believed was a secure communications system. Learning that system had been compromised for years, that every major operation had been conducted under enemy observation, would have shattered confidence in command structures and operational planning, but they never knew. Throughout the war, Japanese forces operated under the assumption that their communications were secure. When operations failed, they attributed failure to American material superiority, better technology, numerical advantages, tactical errors, anything, except the fundamental compromise of their communication security. After the war, during interrogations and investigations, the revelation that JN-25 had been broken was met with disbelief by many Japanese officers. Some refused to accept it. Others demanded proof. The idea that Americans had reconstructed their codebooks through mathematical analysis seemed impossible. The Americans provided proof. They showed Japanese officers their own messages, decrypted and translated. They explained the process, the IBM machines, the staff, the systematic approach to code recovery. They demonstrated how traffic analysis, frequency studies, and linguistic knowledge had combined to break what the Japanese had believed was unbreakable. The evidence was overwhelming. Japanese cryptographers examining the American methods understood immediately what had been done. They also understood that their own assumptions about resource limitations and analytical impossibility had been catastrophically wrong. Captain Toshikazu Ohumae, who had served on the Naval General Staff, reviewed the American signals intelligence operations after the war. His assessment was blunt. The Japanese Navy had been fighting blind while the Americans saw everything. Every fleet movement, every supply convoy, every operational plan had been known to the enemy. The surprise was not that Japan had lost the war. The surprise was that Japanese forces had achieved any successes at all given the intelligence disadvantage under which they operated. The breaking of JN-25 remained classified for decades after the war ended. American signals intelligence capabilities were too valuable to reveal, particularly as Cold War tensions emerged. Personnel who had worked at Station HIPO and other cryptanalytic centers were forbidden from discussing their wartime service. The IBM machines were returned to storage or destroyed. The reconstructed codebooks were locked in archives. The full story of how the United States had read Japanese naval communications throughout the Pacific War remained secret until the 1970s, when declassification finally began revealing what had been accomplished. For the men who had worked in the dungeon at Pearl Harbor, the recognition came late, but was profound. Joseph Rochefort, who had been reassigned to other duties in 1942 after bureaucratic conflicts with Washington, received the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously in 1986. His team members gradually saw their contributions acknowledged as documents were declassified and histories written. The work they had done, the endless hours breaking codes in a hot basement while battles raged across the Pacific, had been as important to victory as any fought with weapons. The lesson that emerged from the JN-25 story was not primarily about cryptography, though the technical achievement was remarkable. The lesson was about the industrial application of intellect to warfare. The United States had recognized that reading enemy communications was worth enormous investment. Hundreds of people, sophisticated equipment, purpose-built facilities, complete organizational support. Breaking codes became an industrial process. scaled up through resources and systematization the same way tank production or shipbuilding had been scaled up. Japan had failed to imagine an enemy might dedicate such resources to cryptanalysis. This failure was not stupidity or carelessness. It was a failure of imagination rooted in different assumptions about how warfare worked and what resources should be prioritized. Japanese planning emphasized operational skill, tactical excellence, and fighting spirit. American planning emphasized systems, resources, and industrial capacity. When these philosophies collided, the side with greater industrial depth and willingness to apply resources to every aspect of warfare, including the intellectual work of code breaking, had an overwhelming advantage. The Japanese officers who had encrypted their messages with careful attention to procedure, who had maintained security of code materials, who had trusted their communication system, had done everything they were supposed to do. They had followed doctrine. They had implemented security measures. They had been betrayed not by carelessness, but by the impossibility of their position. They were fighting an enemy with resources to accomplish what should have been impossible. An enemy who had made the breaking of unbreakable codes into an industrial production line as efficient as any factory. Commander Rochefort, standing in that basement on June 1st, 1942, holding a fragment of decrypted message that mentioned AF, knew something the Japanese Navy would never learn until after the war ended. He knew that every major decision, every fleet movement, every operational plan was being read by people who understood that knowledge was as powerful as any weapon. The Japanese changed their codes and trusted mathematics to protect them. The Americans built an industry to break those codes and trusted that sufficient resources applied systematically would overcome any mathematical complexity. The irony was complete. The Japanese Navy maneuvered across the Pacific, transmitting orders, coordinating operations, maintaining what they believed was secure communications. And 24 hours earlier, sometimes 48 hours earlier, American cryptanalysts had read those orders, translated them, and forwarded them to commanders who used that knowledge to position forces, plan responses, and turn every Japanese operation into an engagement fought on American terms. The outcome of the Pacific War was shaped by many factors: industrial capacity, numerical superiority, strategic decisions. But among those factors, the systematic reading of Japanese naval communications gave the United States an advantage that was decisive. The Japanese never knew they were fighting a war where their enemy saw their every move before they made it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.